So once, long ago, because all these stories happened long ago, of course. Once there was a time when some people were concerned about their status and their place in the world. There was a time when fathers worried about their sons and about their legacy. So as you can tell, a very different time from our time. Once around that time, once behind that time, once beside that time, once below that time, once in front of that time, once upon that time, there was a king. And this king had been blessed with 7 sons, 7 fine princes. And the king was considering his kingdom and his legacy and his sons when it occurred to him that he had 7 grown sons, but none of those sons had a wife. And the king decided it was time to remedy that situation. And so he called his sons to him, and he said, I want 6 of you sons to go out into the world and find princesses, find wives, to carry on the royal line. But I don't want to risk having all 7 of my sons out in the world. So the youngest son will remain here. But I want you older boys to bring back an extra princess for him too.
Nice.
And he gave the 6 older boys many gifts to give in these negotiations with princesses, and he gave them fine raiment and clothing. And he went to the royal stables, and he had the stable master give them 6 magnificent war horses of the kind a prince should have. And he gave them supplies, and the 6 princes rode out into the world in search of brides. And eventually, after a long time or a short time, they came to a kingdom, and in that kingdom there was a king with 6 beautiful daughters. And they paid court, and they made negotiations, and gifts and promises were exchanged, and one thing led to another, and 6 princesses were engaged to the 6 princes. They forgot about their younger brother. And they were making their way back home on their fine war horses with their brides beside them. And it happened that they passed by a mountain with a steep, sheer cliff coming down right near that place. And strangely, there was an enormous door in that cliff, a more than human door in the side of that cliff. And as they rode by that door opened. And stepping out of that door was a giant troll. And that giant troll cast an evil eye on those 6 princes and their princesses, and he turned them all to stone to decorate his front yard. Now time passed as it does. And after a while, it became apparent to the king back home that his sons were very late. And more time passed. And it became apparent to the king that his 6 sons were lost, were not coming back. And he fell into a great despondency. After a time, the youngest prince, some say that the youngest prince was given the name Boots, because people said the king had 6 sons and a 7th to boot. Young prince, whose nickname was Boots, began to ask his father for permission to go and find his brothers, to bring them home. Something terrible must have befallen them. He would go out and find his brothers. But the king said, under no circumstances will I allow it. I have lost 6 sons. I will not lose a 7th. But the young prince kept asking. And finally, in the way that sons do, he wore his father down, and his father gave him permission. But he said, I gave all the good war horses to your brothers, and the only horse I have left for you is a miserable, broken down nag. But it will have to do. And so, on the appointed day, the young prince mounted that miserable, broken down nag, took a meager amount of food, and rode out into the world.
If anybody's ever ridden a miserable nag, you know how bony it is. But there's something else about those miserable old nags, is they know their way around. And so the young prince, Boots, gave that horse its head. And it began to follow the pathways until the pathways diverged a bit from the main road. And he let the intuition of the horse take him where he needed to go. And so it was that this journey ended up being quite long. We've heard about long journeys before. And one day, supplies starting to diminish, he came to a place in the trail where he saw something fluttering. Black wings, barely moving. And he looked down, the horse stopped, and there laying in the trail was a raven. And that raven looked particularly threadbare, let's say. And the raven looked up at him. Food. Food. I'm starving. Do you have a bit of food? And the prince looked down and said, I only have a small amount of provisions. There's not much I can do for you. And the raven replied again, food. And if you give me a bit of food, I will do a favor for you, such that it may save your life. And Boots looks down and says, I don't think that there's much that such as you can do for me. But I'll spare you some food. So he got down, fed the raven, and magically that raven filled out and flew away up into the trees, not too far. And so he got back onto his old horse and he kept on his journey, letting the horse lead him along, looking this way and that, not sure what he was going to find, until he came to a stream. You know how the pathway kind of winds this way and winds back this way to the ford so that it can go across? And as he did, as he neared those rolling waters, he could see something fluttering again on the ground. And some small distance from the stream, on dry land, you could see a salmon. Now, this was not an ordinary salmon. It had the amazing rainbow colors that we often see. But what was truly amazing about this salmon as it lay flopping on the ground, was that when he neared, that salmon stopped flopping, lifted its head, and said, "Good sir, will you put me back in the water? And if you do, I will do you a favor that may very well save your life." And being the kind-hearted person that this prince was, he shook his head and said, "I don't think there's much that such as you could ever do. But I will get you back. For it would be a pity for such as you to pine away on dry land like this." And so he dismounted and he reached down and he pushed the salmon into the river, and the salmon swam this way and that, up the river and down, but not too far. And so Boots got back onto his horse, the old nag, gave the nag its head, and off they went on the trail again. And so it was that they traveled for some distance, some days, we don't know how many. Again, we've been on these journeys. Until they came to a wide place in the path. And there, he could see something moving up and down, up and down. The grayness moving up and down in kind of a rattly sort of way. And as he neared, you could see a wolf. Now this wolf was barely recognizable because of all he was skin and bones. And the up and down as he grew near turned into a rattle such as those which have starved for a long time yet. And he stopped his horse near this wolf. You know, wolves are dangerous, so you don't get too close. And the wolf lifted its head and looked at him. And he said, "Will you give me your horse to eat? For I am starving. The insides of my bones are rattling, my ribs are bumping up against each other. It's been 2 years since I've eaten anything." And the prince said, "There's no way I can give you my horse. I've given food to a raven up the path some days ago. I took time out of my travels to put a salmon back in the river, and now you want my horse? How would I possibly get where I need to go?" And the wolf said, "If you give me your horse to eat, I will do you a favor sometime in the future such that you might live. And because you're on a great travel, the horse will give me the sustenance that I need, and you can ride me." We don't know what goes through the minds of a person in a conundrum like that. Maybe some of us have been in those strange positions where something was requested such that the request was so outlandish. Well, I'll leave it at that and just simply say that he got off of his horse. And that wolf ate the horse. Ate the horse, hide and bones and all. And when he was finished, that magic that we saw with the raven, the strangeness that we saw with the salmon, came forth once again with the wolf, that he was full, vital, muscle. And he nodded at the prince, grabbed the saddle and the reins, threw them over the top of the wolf, put the straps on, even gave him a little nudge in the ribs to make sure the saddle strap was tight. Leapt on the back of that wolf, and the wolf took off, racing down the trail at a speed that he had never been in his life. And so they traveled for a long time until they came to a place where he could see in the distance a tall mountain with a sheer face. And came around the bend, and the wolf stopped, and there was this immense door. Tall, beaten timber, rusted iron straps, the hinge. And the wolf stopped and turned and looked over his shoulder and said to him, I believe that this is where you're supposed to be. Look yonder. And the prince turned his head and looked up the valley just a little bit, and there he could see 12 figures of stone, arrayed around one side of where the door stood. His brothers he could recognize, and 6 apparently beautiful princesses next to them, as decorations in the front of this strange place. And as he looked, a bubble of fear began to rise up in him. And the wolf looked at him and said, where you need to go is through that door. And the prince said, no. If I go through that door, surely I will be killed. Whoever is behind that door will murder. And the wolf whispered in his ear and said, behind that door is a maiden. And if you follow her instructions, you just might survive. And so the young prince got off the wolf and stood across the valley from that door, and he began to walk. And that's where we're going to leave him.
And the wolf said, what you need to do is go in there through that door. And the prince said, I don't think that's a good idea. I think I will be killed. And the wolf said, take courage, for when you go in through that door, you will find that the giant is not home, and inside is a maiden. Do as the maiden instructs you, and there is a small possibility that you will survive. And that's where we left them. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And so the prince walked up to that great, more than human-sized door. And standing a bit on his toes, he was able to grab the very bottom of the door handle. And pulling with all his might, he was able to crack open that door wide enough for him to get through. And he went in, not entirely necessarily believing the wolf had told him the truth. But he went in nevertheless. And there, in that room, was the most beautiful woman he had ever even met. She was a magnificent princess who was the prisoner of the giant. And when she saw him, she said, what are you doing here, young man? This is the home of a terrible giant troll. He will surely kill you. And the prince said, those statues out there are my brothers and their brides, and I have come to rescue them if I can. And the princess said to him, well, that is not an easy thing to accomplish. The giant who lives here does not have his heart in his body. And for that reason, he cannot be killed. Nevertheless, said the prince, I have to try. And the princess said, Well, if you are certain of that, hide under the bed. Don't make a sound, and listen to everything that is said tonight. I will try to find out for you where the giant keeps his heart. And so the prince did as he was instructed. He crawled under the bed, and he remained absolutely silent, and it wasn't very long before the giant came home. He opened that door, he stepped inside and slammed it behind him, and then he sniffed. And he said, "I smell a human." And the princess, thinking quickly, said, "Yes, that's right. There was a magpie that flew over the house, and it dropped a human bone down the chimney. And I threw it out right away. But I suppose the scent must linger." And the giant accepted that with a grunt, and then demanded his supper. And as she was serving the giant his supper, the maiden sighed. And then when she poured some more ale for the giant, she gave another long sigh. And after a third sigh, the giant said, "What are you going on about? What's the matter with you tonight?" And she said, "Well, I'm troubled about something. You know, I don't know where your heart is, and I'm worried. I'm worried someone might find it and might bring harm to you, for I've grown so very fond of you." And the giant said, "Oh, it's in a place no one will ever find it. You don't need to worry about that." She said, "Still, it weighs on my mind. I worry. If only I knew where it was." And the giant said, "It's under the threshold. Under the threshold of the big door." And so the giant went to bed, and the night passed, and in the morning the giant went out to do whatever giants do. And the prince crawled out from under the bed, and he and the princess immediately went to the threshold, and they began to dig under that threshold. And they dug it up. They dug all underneath it, and they searched everywhere. They found no sign of the giant's heart. And they realized they'd been lied to. And so they put all the dirt back and tried to make things look exactly as it had been. And to cover their tracks, the princess ran out and picked beautiful bouquets of wildflowers and made garlands and bouquets and set them on that place right on the threshold. And then the giant came home that evening, and again he said, "I smell a stench of a human." And the princess said, "Yes, that damn magpie flew over the chimney and dropped another human bone in there. And I flung it out as quickly as I could, but I suppose the stink must last a while." And the giant accepted that. And then the princess again began to sigh and to mope. And the giant went to bed that night.
So the princess stood near the giant's bed, and she continued to sigh. And the giant, that giant troll, rolled this way and that, trying to sleep. But listening to that sighing, he finally rolled over and grumbled. "What are you going on about?" And she finally said, "Well, it's about that. I care about you so much that I put all of those flowers there. And you didn't say anything. Because I have made this gesture of beauty." And the giant said, "Ah, foolish girl. That's not where my heart is. No, listen." And she said, "I've heard everything that you say to me, I believe, because I care for you so much. If that's not where your heart is, I've made this gesture of flowers and beauty for no reason." And the giant rolled over and said, "Well, it's in that wardrobe, that trunk over there." And he rolled over and went to sleep. Now, the prince, underneath the bed, the weight of that giant creaking right over his head. Rhyme unintended. Heard everything. And in the morning, the giant got up early as was his usual habit, and he went out the door without saying a word and did what giant trolls do. And as soon as that great door slammed shut, the two of them got together. He scrambled out from underneath the bed. She leapt off of her windowsill, and together they went to that wardrobe, and they opened it, and they dug inside. They took everything out of it. It was a big trunk, by the way. And they checked all of the walls inside that trunk. They looked underneath it. They scooted away from the wall. They looked in the lid. They even went through the little hasps just in case there was a secret compartment where a heart might be hidden. But nothing was there. And at the end of the day, they put everything back in, scooted it all into place. And she raced outside, gathered more wildflowers, made wreaths, and decorated that trunk, that wardrobe, in such a way that it was beautiful. The beauty was amazing. And as soon as they heard the giant come, she ushered the young prince back under the bed, whispered to him once again, because he wasn't so bright, so he used to be quiet. The giant came in, crashing this way, crashing that way. We know the type. Sat down to his dinner, sniffed the air. "I smell a human." And the princess once again, "It was that darned magpie flying overhead with a human bone, dropped it down the chimney. And as soon as it landed, I saw what it was, and I flung it out the window as quickly as I could. That must be what you smell." And the giant said nothing, but dipped his head to his food and began to slurp it up. And as soon as he was finished, he looked over and he saw the wreaths and the flowers on the trunk, and he said, "What is that? Is that more tomfoolery?" And she said, "Well, I have such high regard for you that I thought it would make the place that your heart rests beautiful." He said, "It's not there." He said, "Well, you told me that that was where your heart was, so of course I believed you. Where could it be if you told me that it's in two places? What should I think? My regard for you is so high." And he listened to her, shook his head, and finally said, convinced, "Well, it's in a place that you would never be able to find, nor anyone else." And her voice got soft, And she said, well, where could it be? And he said, a long ways from here. Many days' journey. There is a great cold mountain lake. And in the midst of that mountain lake is an island, barren except for an ancient castle, the walls around which protect a small pond, a well, if you will. And in that well is a duck. And inside that duck is an egg. And inside that egg is my heart. With that, he rolled over, went to sleep, just like we did tonight. So in the morning, with that knowledge, the prince lay underneath that bed, heard the creaking of the giant lift himself up, put his heavy feet onto the floor, and prepare himself for his early day off into the world, nobody knows where or why. And out that great door he went, that door clanged shut, and when it shut, he crawled out from underneath the bed. And the young princess looked at him. She had both fear in her eyes, love for him, because something had bugged, and uncertainty. And he looked at her and he said, I have to go. I need to make this journey. And I have no idea where this place is. I hope I can find it. And she gave him that look. We've seen that look. And so out that front door he went, and when he stepped out into the light of day, to his amazement, you know what was waiting for him? A wolf with a saddle on his back. What the heck is that? And the wolf looked at him, and he looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at him, and he looked at the wolf, and he said, I have to find a lake with an island, with a castle, with a well, and a duck, and an egg, and a heart, and I have no idea where I'm going. And the wolf looked at him. Have you ever seen a wolf look, in your direction, whether it's in film or in real life? Their head kind of hits just low, and they have that kind of, there's a kind of look that they have that tells you that they're seeing something that you may not have any idea of. That's how this looked at him. Wolf looked at him. And then that wolf said, get on my back. I'll get you there. And so he slung his leg over the back of the wolf, and off they went racing. Into the woods, through the mountains, down through the valleys, over hills, underneath strange, wild places, along paths that barely seemed like paths. And they went for a long time. Many days they went without stopping. This was an epic, exhausting journey. And after a really long time, they came to a place where in the distance he could see a shimmering coming up through and around the trees, and when they broke through the trees, they could see a great, still, dark lake. And in the distance, he could see an island with what looked like maybe an old castle up there. And the wolf stopped at the shore, panting. And he was sitting there on the wolf, looking at that lake, looking at that castle. Way in the distance, he said, there's no way. I cannot cross this lake. That water is too deep, too cold. There's nothing in me that can make that journey. And the wolf looked over his shoulder and said, I'll get you there. And with that, he leapt into the air and splashed down into the lake and began to paddle. Have you ever seen wolves paddle across great water? They do. They do. They have been known to swim as much as 5 miles or more. And this wolf swam our young prince across that lake until they reached the far rocky shore, and up onto the ground they went, up to the front door of that castle, which was locked. And when they looked, here and there and all around for some way in, there was no way in until up in a tall watchtower, way, way up on the top of the ramparts of that castle, they could see a place where there hung on a hook a key. And that key was so far up and so inaccessible that the young man said, there is no way I can reach that key. And the wolf looked at him and did this. He did, really? It seems to me, said the wolf, that you met somebody along this pathway who might be able to get that key for you. And the young man, Raven could do this. And as soon as he said the word Raven, there came a flapping over his shoulder, and there, swirling around his head. I've had ravens swirling around my head before. It's an amazing thing to see. Those great black wings stretched out, and that baleful eye looking down, and it's like, it's pretty strange. But he looked up at that raven and said to the raven and said, is there any way that you can reach that key far up on the rampart? And the raven looked down at him and said, you once did me a favor by giving me some food and tending to my particular needs in that moment. For that gift of compassion, I will fly up there and get that key for you and bring it back. And so he did. Reached up there, turned it upside down, grabbed hold of that key, lifted it off the hook, flew it back down to him, and dropped it into his hand. And together, the wolf and the raven and the young prince went to that door. He unlocked it, pulled it open, creaking. And in the door they went, and in the distance they could see a well in the center of that courtyard. And we went up to the well, and there, now this was a large well, maybe as big as this circle, there was a duck. Might have been a mallard going in a circle. You ever seen a female mallard? They have that kind of mottled brownish color. They're beautiful. Going around and around, but never quite close to the shore. And so the young prince coaxed, begged, touched the water, until finally, after a long time, that duck came right near him. And he reached out, put his hands around the duck, lifted it up out of the water, and as he did, that duck laid the egg. It hit the water, and he could see it doing the way eggs do down to the bottom.
Oh, no.
And he sat there, and his shoulders dropped. And he looked at the raven, he looked at the wolf, and he goes, what can I do? Both the raven and the wolf turned to him and gave him that look. And they both said, alternating, it seems that you knew someone along your journey who might owe you a favor. The light went on, and as soon as he said the word, there is a salmon that I helped along the way. He could hear splashing in the lake outside. He turned around, he went to the door, peered out, and there, leaping in the water, was the salmon. And he went to the shore, and the salmon looked up at him and said, you once did me a favor, now it's time for me to do you a favor. Carry me to the well. And so he reached under the salmon, he lifted him up, wriggling, went back to the well, threw him in, and the salmon swam in a circle all the way down until he disappeared. And it didn't take that long Well, it took long enough for him to wonder until out from the darkness of the depths of the well, he could see the shimmering of the back of the salmon, and there the salmon appeared with an egg in his mouth. And he lifted the egg out of the salmon's mouth.
And the wolf said, "Now, just give that egg a little squeeze." And he squeezed the egg. He didn't break it, he just squeezed it. And far off, that giant felt a tightness in his chest. And he knew someone had found where his heart lay. And he went running with giant strides, covering that long distance in a matter of moments. And soon he was there at the island. And he saw the prince holding the egg. And the wolf said, "Squeeze it again." Which he did. And the giant winced and grabbed that empty spot in his chest. And then the wolf said, "Make him free your brothers and their brides. Make him turn them back into their human form, so they are no longer stone statues." And the giant began to plead and beg and say he would do anything. And so the prince said, "Transform my brothers and their brides back into their human form." And the giant said, "Yes, yes, it is done. I have done it." And then the wolf said, "Now break the egg."
Now what?
Now break the egg. And he broke that egg in his hand. And when he exposed the heart inside to the sun and to the wind, the giant collapsed and became a hill in that place. You could go there now. And then the prince got back on the wolf, and he rode back to the place, that place with the door in the side of the cliff. And there were all his brothers and their brides, and there was the princess who had helped him. And they all got on their horses, and he and the princess got on his wolf. And they rode back to their father's kingdom. And the old king was overjoyed to see all 7 of his sons and 7 new daughter-in-laws there. And of course, there was a great wedding, there was a great feast, and at the feast, because the old king found the bride of the youngest prince to be the most charming, the most beautiful, and the most wise, they were given the place of honor. Now you know, outside the feasting hall, sitting on a branch, there was a woodpecker. And this whole story was related at the feast in the way those things are done. And the woodpecker found it to be fascinating and interesting, and the woodpecker took it off and carried it. And it was passed on for many generations of woodpeckers. But one year, hundreds of years later, there was a woodpecker carrying that story, and for some reason, he decided to drum it into the side of a hazel tree. He gave the story to the hazel tree, and the hazel tree took it. And it made the hazelnuts especially sweet. And people kept gathering those hazelnuts and planting them here and there. Some of them might have even come to Minnesota and been planted there. And it happened that one of those hazel trees was in a field where a farmer kept hogs. And the hogs gorged themselves on those hazelnuts. And it made the pork especially delicious. And so people kept breeding those pigs, and it just so happened that Ben and I had a dinner of pork chops from some of those hogs, and the story went into us, and now we've told you.